Let's give Robyn a nice welcome. Buffalo.
Hello, Buffalo. It's so great to be here. I really appreciate, the opportunity to come and speak to people about my research on the history of the Black Panther Party. I appreciate supporting independent bookstores because they're increasingly rare spaces of community, of collective thinking, of collective agitation, of so many good things that happen in spaces like this. So I do hope that you continue to support this bookstore. I purchased like 7 books, some for my daughter, some for myself, just in the first hour that I was here. So I hope that you continue to support the bookstore. So I'm a history professor. I teach at Lehman College at the City University of New York. And I'm here to talk about my book, The Revolution Has Come, which looks at the history of the Black Panther Party through the lens of organizational history, through the lens of gender, and focuses on the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. So the book was published in December of 2016. And since then, I've had the opportunity to go around and talk to more and more people about it. I think that as events unfolded in terms of the US elections, the interest in my book and in a radical past, in a potentially different future, arose exponentially, and it's really, I think, created a space for radical conversations and radical rememberings of a past that oftentimes is erased and is not really brought to us via our mainstream history textbook. So it's really great to have the opportunity to kind of unveil this history to you and with you. So I want to talk a little bit about my history, the history of the book, and then what's in the book all together. So I started writing this book. It was my doctoral dissertation. I grew up in New York, in Brooklyn, and I became interested in the Black Panther Party when I was an undergraduate student at SUNY Binghamton, the state, SUNY Binghamton. I have to explain that, but not in Buffalo. So I took a class called Women in Social Movements. It was taught by historian Elsa Barkley Brown. She's currently teaching at University of Maryland, College Park. And it was a class called Women in Social Movements. And at that point, I was a history major. I had wrenched myself free of a pre-med major, which was not working for me, despite my parents' dreams of 6-figure incomes. And I had decided I was going to go into history. And her class was really instrumental. It was a class, Women in Social Movements, and we got a chance to read Assata Shakur's autobiography. And reading that book was very pivotal to my development and my interest in the Black Panther Party. Because Assata, first of all, she grew up and was talking about like the Bronx and going to BMCC, and her whole life was sort of unveiling where my life, was unfolding as well. And I think that because when I went to SUNY Binghamton, I did find myself in the culture shock of being in a very undiverse environment that didn't feel very politically progressive, and becoming a student activist and becoming aware of kind of fighting injustice. And I had grown up without really that strong sensibility around that. It felt like in my mind, when I thought about groups like the Ku Klux Klan or something, I thought about it in a Southern sense. So when I went to upstate New York and there they were, it was really kind of a lesson for me. And reading Assata in that context was more than just like reading a ordinary, interesting book. It was revelatory. The structure of the book is very beautiful. She has speeches in there. She has poems in there. And each chapter kind of goes back and forth in her past. It doesn't unfold in a linear way. So it starts out, it's sort of her contemporary sense, and it goes back to her childhood, and it kind of goes back and forth that way. So reading that book was very pivotal to me, and it made me interested in learning about the Black Panthers. And so what I would do is I would go in sort of my freeish time, and I would go to the library and I would check out books on the Black Panther Party, the Black Power movement, the Civil Rights movement, but I would only read autobiographies because I found them interesting. It was like, nice to read one person's story. And I kind of got to the end of the list. I read H. Rap Brown's, I read Huey Newton's, I read Bobby Seale's, I read Leroy Jones, I read, everyone that I could I could do. I did interlibrary loan, and then, in the days before the internet, that was like it. So when I went off to graduate school, I had decided that that's what I wanted my contribution to be, is to figure out a way of taking all those individual stories and putting them together in a larger history. And I also had decided that, that it was very important to do this for political purposes. Now, by then, there was a lot going on in the world outside of my Binghamton bubble that was also pushing me towards thinking critically about these issues. So, for example, the Central Park jogger case in 1989 was very pivotal. 1989 is when I graduated from college, and I went off to graduate school starting in 1990. And there was a lot of discourse around racism, police brutality, the criminal justice system, the incarceration of young people. I mean, everywhere, right? This case, I think, especially where I was, it just, took over the headlines, the way that people talked about the young men. Women were called on to think about their feminist, loyalties in the wake of this horrific attack. I mean, it was like everything, it was all the people were talking about. And it really made me start to think about like the question of gender and what role does gender play in sort of these larger things. Also, there were also, moments of triumph at that time with Nelson Mandela being released from prison. And Winnie Mandela in particular was a hero at that time. I remember her, when she came to Harlem, seeing her on television, the way that she really was the face of the Free Mandela movement at the time really had an impact on me. And of course, seeing the Rodney King beating was also pivotal. I think that today, because we have such spectacle around the brutalization and death of black bodies, that it may seem, you may not remember the first or your first, right? But there was a first, right, in all of our moments where we saw this unfold, right, this horror story unfold in front of us, and then we responded. And sometimes that moment changed our lives, right? So for many people, for an earlier generation, that might have been the Emmett Till case, right? To actually see Emmett Till's face and read his story and file by his coffin and things like that. If you're around the 50s, for me it was Rodney King, to to see that beating unfold on television, to hear the discourse around that, to the acquittal of the police officers, the the urban uprisings. It was like a script that was from the past that was repeating itself, right? And we're living in the wake of those scripts still being repeated now. So learning about all of those things really pushed me towards more of a political consciousness around where I wanted my scholarly work to go, and also thinking more deeply about the potential impact of this work on the Black Panthers. So in 1996, I went off to California. So I started graduate school in 1990. In 1996, I went off to California, my first research trip. And it was very big for me. I learned how to drive in order to go to California, because I was told there's no public transportation there. I would have to drive. So I got my driver's license like in the span of like 8 weeks or something, and I head out there for the freeway system in California, and I survived. But I got a chance to really go out there and to meet people, right? The Huey Newton archives had just been bought by Stanford University. So for the first time, there was a repository of hundreds of boxes of information about the Black Panther Party. That was very important, because before, when I would tell people, oh, I want to write about this organization, after they said, what organization, what are you talking about? If you remember the moments before the Black Panther Party might have been a household name, there was a time where you would say that you're talking about the Black Panther Party and no one would know who you're talking about. So I'd have to do that information. They would say, well, what are you going to do? What kind of records are you going to use? Is this going to be oral history? Imagining that there was nothing to do to recover that history but to talk to people, right? But then here came these archives that were sold to Stanford. And it was hundreds of boxes of organizational materials. So I saw that they were memos, that they took minutes from their meetings, that there was letterheaded points, that people wrote them letters, then got letters back, that there were daily work reports, that there were speeches that were typed, that there were receipts from, houses that were purchased, that there were so many hundreds and hundreds of pages of materials to really prove to any disbeliever that the Black Panther Party was indeed an organization not akin to the NAACP, et cetera, in terms of politics, but in terms of the stuff of organization, that the Panthers did have that they were organized, that they did have offices and files and, you know, bookkeeping, and they did attempt to do that even as they tried to make revolution. And that seemed to be very important to me. So when I went off to Stanford, and I was in the Bay Area and I would drive down to Stanford every day, it was very important to sort of make that kind of connection. The second thing that happened during that summer was it was the Panthers' 30th year anniversary. So it was 1996. They were founded in 1966. So many people were coming there for the celebration. So I got a chance to meet other scholars who were working with the Panthers, like over here. That's me over there, and that's my friend Tracy and Angela. They were both working on Panther Women. You know, I got a chance to really meet people. And one of the things I got to do was I got to meet some of the Panther leaders I'd only read about. So I got to meet Bobby Seale and his brother and his family members and many people who were involved in the Black Panther Party. And they were kind enough to share their stories with me. And it was very important for me to get their stories at that moment because the Panthers at that point, like I said, had not really been discovered. Right, so when you're interviewing someone, it might be their first or second or third interview compared to today. When you go to interview Kathleen Cleaver today about the Black Panther Party, you're hard-pressed to come up with a question she has not heard or answered before. This was not the case in 1996, right? There was a freshness to those interviews. There was a rawness to those interviews. It was closer to the time. It was only 30 years. People had a strong sense of remembrance about those times. They were still in the wake of those times. So I did many of my interviews in this time period, even though I went back and I did interviews throughout the process as I was writing the book as well. And throughout, you know, those opportunities, I really started to think about, well, what is going to be my angle, you know, into this history, right? Just like any, you know, college student, you have your paper topic, like I'm going to write about slavery. Then your professor says, and what about slavery? And oftentimes that's the moment of panic, like, you know, what am I supposed to be focusing on? So as I was reading through everything in the archives, and I got the opportunity to really be the first person to have access to the archives because they weren't processed yet. In other words, they were not cataloged, they were not available to the public. So I had the opportunity to go behind the scenes and kind of see everything that was there. Like I said, everything from the healthcare records to minutes and memos and all of that. I looked through everything. Like every single piece of paper I ran my eyes over in those archives. The only thing I didn't look at were things I couldn't because of format. So they were reel-to-reel tapes, for example, that I couldn't listen to. They were audio cassettes. I listened to those, but I couldn't listen to the other tapes. So that kind of became my archive. And all of that led me to the intellectual framework of the book, which is really to think about the Black Panther Party through the lens of organizational history, right? Imagining that they were a political vehicle that was self-consciously created with this ideal of revolution that changed over time, and to think about, well, what did that mean in terms of the Panther history, how they unfolded, their legacy, the repression they faced, etc. Second is to think about gender, right? A lot of the people that I found working on and within the Black Panther Party were women. I found that the people who were running their programs were women. The women who were typing all of those minutes, for example, were women. You know, that women were really playing such a big role within the organization. So that was very, very important to me as well. And then I wanted it to be a local history. It seemed to me that the Panthers in Oakland were different from what I knew about the Panthers in New York. And they were different from what I knew about the Panthers in Chicago, and so on and so on and so on. So I wanted to ensure that my book would have this kind of local flavor. When I went to Oakland, I found that many of the people who were involved in the Panthers, they were one generation removed from the rural South, and many of their parents had migrated to Oakland from Texas and Louisiana and other places. So even when I went to Oakland, I got a chance to just feel the vibe of the city, and, you know, to hear the mams and the food, experience the food culture, and just to understand that Oakland was also a southern place, even though it was not geographically in the South. but it was connected to this history. And Southerners had made Oakland their own in some ways, right? In ways that I could see. So when I would ask people, for example, about armed self-defense, they may talk to me about their family history of the Deacons for Defense, which was a self-defense organization that defended civil rights workers who were nonviolent, but they themselves were armed. So there was a political history that was there. There was a cultural history that was there. And I wanted that to kind of ebb and flow and be kind of part of the backdrop of the book, so that when people read it, they would feel like they learned a little bit more about what Oakland, California was like. So thinking about the local history, right? So again, thinking about Oakland in terms of its space on the West Coast and thinking about it as a place bounded by the Pacific Ocean was important, because Oakland in a lot of ways I think speaks to the particular diversity that was there. So in terms of thinking about Black, Asian, radical traditions of struggle, those were very, very clear in Oakland in a way that was not the same in, let's say, in New York, right? Geographically, the Chinatown in Oakland was right next to West Oakland, which was, you know, where the Panthers had gotten their start. So making that connection was very important. Again, I mentioned Oakland's Southern roots as part of sort of my book finishing ritual. I got a chance to go down to Mississippi. I got a chance to go to the park where Stokely Carmichael issued the call for Black Power. That call for Black Power was very important. It motivated people all around the country to reframe their activism, to reimagine their future in a way that was more culturally grounded, that was more politically progressive in some ways. So going back to that place, you know, this park, which is in Greenwood, Mississippi, was very important. At the same time, when I went there, I realized that just like Oakland, when I went to Oakland in 1996, when I went back in like 2014, 2015, 2016, it's a different place, right? But then some things are the same, right? Like poverty, for example, right? Dispossession, unequal education. All of the things that the Panthers rose up to address seem to be still there. So it made me think about, like, what did Black Power offer to the Black Panthers? How did they define Black Power in their way? And it made me start to think about, well, how can I bring out this sensibility in the storytelling that was part of the book? So Oakland is also part of the larger region, right? So I looked a lot at the impact and influence of Watts on Oakland, whether it be the Watts uprising that happened there, or the actual political traditions. So Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, who founded the Panthers in 1966, they started out with armed police patrols, which were legal at the time, and they got that idea from activists who were doing it in Seattle and who were doing it in Los Angeles and all around the country as well. So again, trying to put the Panthers in this sort of larger political tradition and not thinking about them as so unique, and thinking about the Panthers as part of the larger Bay Area. You know, it's very important to imagine that Huey Newton and Bobby Seale spent a lot of time in Berkeley, right, just nearby Berkeley, you know, grounding themselves in conflict and cooperation with the white left that was there, getting involved in the free speech movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement. There was a real synergy between the Panthers' evolving radicalism and their relationships with the growing white left at that time. Also in San Francisco, we have Black Studies battles, you know, at San Francisco State, the struggle around ethnic studies, and the way in which this radicalized student population was trying to argue for a different vision of what political education looked like. So the Panthers were also part of that. And to me, learning that and putting Oakland in that context challenged the assumptions that many people had, that the Panthers kind of drew from only people who were in the streets. Certainly they drew from people who were in the streets, but they also drew from people who were college students, people who had been seasoned activists, and who had participated in other movements as well. So I found a lot of diversity in terms of who became Panthers, when they became Panthers, etc. Right. So, yeah, I think I wanted this one to kind of show us that, that sense of the larger Bay Area. So you get a sense of where Berkeley is rather in relation to Oakland, right? And just to give you a sense of that. And you don't have to cross any bridge or anything. You just kind of drive over, and it's all very connected. So gender was also very big in terms of my understanding of the Black Panther Party. The Panthers were founded in October of 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, who were community college students at the time. They were founded in a way that appealed to people who were struggling against poverty, against police brutality. This was the reality for Black women in Oakland at the time. The Panthers very much saw themselves as making that kind of connection between the material realities that people face and the possibilities for changing those realities. So they would always be out there trying to get their finger on the pulse of the community. So it's important to note that when I say the Panthers, and I'm in 1966, I'm talking about fewer people than we have in this room. I'm talking about just the front row, 5 people. Right. So important to think about the Panthers in 1966 and their attempt to go from 5 people to 30 people to 300 people to 3,000 people. Like how were they able to make that move? And the original Panthers, the people that were drawn to their platform and program initially, were the people that they knew. Much like if you were starting a group, you might knock on your neighbor's door. You may try to get your friend's little brother and your friend. So they started out with people that they knew. This sort of relationship between people of trust, with these close bonds, and they grew from there. They started out as primarily men, and women began to join in the spring of 1967. And I found that as women joined the organization, they really pushed for the organization to kind of confront and face different tensions that were there in terms of the organizing, in terms of the vision, in terms of the rhetoric, etc. So women joined the organization and they changed the organization, right? They pushed it in directions that were more egalitarian. They challenged the way in which some men were conceptualizing a vision of revolution that was very patriarchal, and they challenged women as well, right? And they aligned themselves with some progressive men as well. So important to think about that. And to me, that was a key part of the politics of the Black Panther Party. It wasn't external or an aside kind of thing, or but let's talk about the election campaigns and the police patrols. Those things, I felt like the gender politics were just as important as those other types of politics, right? I also felt that I could tell the story of the Black Panther Party in a way that centered women's voices and contributions. So that's what I tried to do within the book, right? So women, as I mentioned, joined the organization in Oakland in the spring of 1967, right? And even though there are many, many images of these Panther women, and I mentioned that Panther women were actually the majority of members at times in their history, yet when I say Black Panther Party, in this time period, this is the image I think that comes to mind. Right? And it's unfortunate, this is still the image that comes to mind today. Now, the interesting thing is that I feel like these images do a disservice to the men, right? Which is the other thing that I found. I found that by creating a more complicated picture of women within the Black Panther Party, I was able to create a more complicated picture of the men as well, right? So these images of the men don't really show them doing anything. They're marching, right? This is what they're doing, right? So they're marching. They're symbolically displaying weapons. It's a very powerful image of bravado, etc. But you don't see the work. And one of the things that was so important to me in terms of thinking about the Panthers' history was really to emphasize the work that it took. Because I think that there's a romantic sensibility around these political organizations. It's not there for some of the civil rights organizations. We know what they're doing in our heads, right? We imagine that they're doing voter registration activity and they're knocking on doors and they're doing things. But when you're thinking about what it meant to be a member of the Black Panther Party, oftentimes I found that there was just an emptiness of imagination there. We might imagine that they were polishing their guns a lot, right? We don't know what they did on a day-to-day basis to keep the organization going. And I found that by showing the pictures of women and looking at the things that women did, I was able to provide a complex picture of the work that men and women did within the organization. So, for example, women did everything from clerical work, like helping to produce the Panther's newspaper. The newspaper was a major area of work. It united people all around the country. Every single chapter sold a newspaper. And selling the newspaper was something that they did to generate income for the organization and for themselves. I found that the newspapers were targeted by the FBI. They were oftentimes the delay of the delivery of the newspaper. I found a lot of airline records about lost newspapers, claim certificates, soaked newspapers arriving soaked to their destinations as they tried to ship the newspapers all around the country. So the work of the newspaper was hard work. Men and women did that work. Emory Douglas, the Panther graphic artist, very well known. He was definitely responsible for many of the iconic images that came, along with the newspaper. But also, men and women wrote articles. They laid out the paper. They did a lot of work around that, and not because they went to school for graphic arts or communications. They learned on the job, right? Teenagers, disciplined. And they did it because they had to do it and because they wanted to do it, right? And they passed on those skills. So women and men worked on the newspaper. You see women also doing the work of the community programs within the organization. So one of the most popular programs was the Breakfast for School Children program. And women and men would wake up 5 o'clock in the morning sometimes to prepare breakfast for kids before school. Right. And what I found is that there were rules around that. I mean, you tell anyone to wake up 5 o'clock week after week after week. There's going to be the day where it's 5 o'clock and you're still sleeping. Right. There were consequences for that, right, within the organization. Right. There was a disciplined band. I mean, you couldn't get people to get up at 5 if it was okay not to get up at 5. Right. So they had ways of disciplining people, of encouraging them, of denying them privileges, and all of that was part of who the organization was, right? That it was disciplined, that you didn't just go down and say, I'm a Black Panther on Mondays and Fridays between, 8 and 12, because I've got a life to live outside of that. No, you were a full-time member, and oftentimes that meant a level of sacrifice that was, I think for us today, who you may have a hard time, like even giving your cell phone to someone, loaning them that. People who joined the Black Panther Party would oftentimes give in their property. If you have like 10 pairs of sneakers and you go into the Black Panther Party, they may say, well, you need 2, but then some people don't have any, and then your sneakers are being worn by people around you. And nobody wants to hear how you feel about that. You just have to, this is your contribution to the revolution, right? You have to change your mentality. They were also talking about challenging capitalism. It sounds good when you're challenging capitalism out there, but when it's your closet, it's a different story. And the Panthers really went into those personal spaces, and, people made those sacrifices, those painful, individual, look at myself in the mirror, can I do this kind of sacrifices. I mean, that is what it meant to be part of the organization. The Black Panther Party also registered people to vote, which is also part of their history that people tend not to know so much about, but they participated in election campaigns from the early third-party campaigns in the late 60s to working with the Democratic Party in the 1970s. They definitely focused some of their attention on the role of electoral politics and social movement as well. And of course, you see women Panthers getting arrested. And the arrest of the Black Panther Party, the harassment, the infiltration of the Panthers, the phony letters that were sent, the death plots that were executed, really transformed the organization. And you really sort of see that working its way in the book as well. So here's women coming out of a political education class. The Panthers really worked hard to educate themselves, which I think people oftentimes don't think about. One of the things I found is that many of the Panther leaders published books and speeches that were published at the time of the organization was alive. This was not unusual. I mean, this is, these movements at the time.
The yellow C button.
Thank you. These movements at the time, they saw themselves as creating an intellectual, literature of struggle. And there was a market for this, right? There was a market for this. So you could produce Huey Newton's speeches in a book and sell those. You could produce Bobby Seale's, autobiography and sell that, right? You could produce, all of the books of those times by George Jackson and by others. We don't think about it, but that was an education process for the members of the organization, for the larger society. And what I found is when I would open up, those files that said things like, bank receipts or ledger records and things like that, I would find that the organization was funding itself using advances from those book purchases and the royalties from their books, right? Which I think is also important because we don't know how these organizations funded themselves, right? I mean, how can we even imagine what it means to be part of a revolutionary organization? We don't think critically about the funding sources. What were the pros and cons of the types of funding that the Panthers pursued? How did it help their cause and how did it harm their cause? Right? These are particular questions that I wanted to sort of highlight in the book. So I wanted to show a clip which shows just 2 minutes, and it gives you a sense of what it was like to be a woman in the Black Panther Party at the time. It's nice because it gives us some footage and gives you some faces and some voices to sort of put together as women talk about what they did. After all that prep. I didn't know. I'm going to go back.
For a breakfast program. So I was between
Okay, I'm going to start it over just because. Okay.
labor cooking breakfast for a breakfast program. So I was between contractions wasn't pancakes.
I would spend all the day answering the phones, even after I had my son when I came back to work. I used to have to jump him up and down really heavy because it just wouldn't stop crying as I'm answering the phone.
You name it. I clean freezers with a toothpick.
And that's how I answer the phone. Black Panther Party National Headquarters, Black Panther Party Central Headquarters, can I help you?
Dear Huey, when I joined the party, I was thrilled about becoming part of an organization that believes in the equality of men and women. It bothers me that there are brothers who still view women as sexual objects. We should have no men in the Black Panther Party who feel this way, or women for that matter.
One of the ironies of the Black Panther Party is that the image is the black male with the jacket and the gun, but the reality is that the majority of the rank and file by the end of the 60s are women.
Everybody knows that all the people don't have liberty, all the people don't have freedom, all the people don't have justice, and all the people don't have power, so that means none of us do.
The Black Panther Party certainly had a chauvinist tone, and so we tried to change some of the clear gender roles so that women had guns and men cooked breakfast for children. Did we overcome it? Of course we didn't. As I like to say, we didn't get these brothers from revolutionary heaven.
That's from the Vanguard of the Revolution, which is all on YouTube. That came out, I believe it's 2 years ago now. But I think it's a great documentary for anyone who wants to see more images and have more food for thought and use it as a springboard to learn more. So the organizational history, again, was very important to me. To me, it's sort of the big the biggest architecture within the book, right? So again, my goal was to highlight the political work, right? I found lots of documents around the type of political work that Panthers did, and the sense that there was discipline around that. So it's like when you see something that says all laggards will be suspended immediately. People don't put that, it's like a syllabus, you don't put in there, and there's no late policy here unless you've been asked for that a million times. So the ideal is that they were laggards, right? And the idea was to tell people that that was not going to be tolerated, right? Because it wasn't easy to be a member of the Black Panther Party. It wasn't glamorous, but many people felt like they, dedicated their lives to that kind of work. So again, as I say up there about selling the newspapers, very, very important as well, right? So here's some images of the newspaper being sold. In particular, I like to show that the little kid over there, he's not a member of the organization, but because you could sell the paper for 25 cents and keep a nickel, it was incentive for young kids in the neighborhood to come in, grab a stack of papers, and go out and sell them, right? They had an amazing distribution plan, and the Black Panther became one of the most popular underground newspapers in the time period. And just to show you, like as she said, with the men serving breakfast, I mean, definitely everyone served breakfast within the organization. And the breakfast program was not just in Oakland. In fact, many of the programs were not necessarily largest or most deep within Oakland. So they've spread around the country to places like Baltimore, in Illinois as well. Okay. And here's a great image of some of the Panther children who participated in one of their most long-standing programs, the Oakland Community School. And again, to think about the role that education played within the organization and all of the different things they were trying to do in terms of creating an alternative model, right? Not just talking about it, but to actually try to put it into place. Which is not to say that it was a flawed or there weren't problems or issues or drawbacks or anything like that, but I'm always astounded by what they were able to accomplish, right? Imagining that many of the people who joined the organization, if you started in 1966, you had dropped out of high school, you were 17, 16, 10 years later, 1976, you're now 26, 27, and as the Black Panther Party kind of ages as an organization, after COINTELPRO has such a devastating impact on the ability of the organization to thrive by attacking the leaders and things like that, you really have a slow death of the organization in the late 1970s, right? But the Oakland Community School becomes the program that gets centered around, that many, many people focus on. So I wanted to read just a little bit from the book. As I mentioned, when I first learned about Assata, I love that she put her poetry in the book. I think it really kind of speaks to people in a different way. It's just very emotional, I thought. So I included some of Ericka Huggins' poetry in the book, just to give us a sense of what it might have felt like to be part of the organization at the time. Ericka Huggins was someone who joined the Black Panther Party. She came from Connecticut. She drove down to LA with her husband, who was then killed. She was incarcerated. She was a young mother at the time. She spent much time in solitary confinement. She was a political prisoner. She came out and continued to play a role with the leadership of the organization, especially in the Oakland Community School. And one of the things that she talks about in terms of what she was able to do to sort of keep grounded while she was incarcerated was to write poetry. She also talks a little bit about spirituality and the way that that played a role in her life. But I wanted to read this poem that she wrote called In Oakland. And it describes the mixture of hard work and comradeship that was so important for many people in the organization. So she says, East 14th Street, cement, tar, blinking traffic lights, the yellow of yesterday, the red of today, the green of tomorrow. Our lives have never been normal. We are part of tomorrows. Our todays and yesterdays quickly become a vague memory, so quickly do we move. Sometimes we can stop to look at ourselves in motion and love ourselves and each other. These are the good times, the comradely times, when we can celebrate life. And I wanted people who read the book to kind of imagine not just the work, but the joys, the comradeships, the friendships within the organization that kept it going. And that doesn't always mean that it kept it going in the most, conflict-free way. Just think about any large family gathering you may attend. You're all there. You're all committed to something, right? This larger notion of family, or we got to get together, it's a holiday, or whatever it is that you're committed to. But within there, you may have people that are, in conflict. But you put that conflict aside to at least come to the table. And that's what people in the organization did, right? They were able to be comrades despite the struggles that they had. And they were able to keep pressure around some of those struggles, because some of those struggles were struggles around gender, and some of those struggles were struggles around individualism, and other things as well that were eating away at sort of the flesh of the organization. But many, many people continued on until they couldn't, leaving letters like the one you saw in the video, which talked about why they were leaving and why that was the case. So that seems very important as well. I think that today this book really speaks to where we are in terms of Black liberation politics. When the poem says the red of today, as I was reading it, I was just thinking that the red of today makes me think of sort of the bloodiness of today, the wars of today, the undeclared wars, that are happening in our streets, in our communities, and then the wars that are being fought by the military by the military boots on the ground, as well as through, all sorts of sophisticated technology that no longer requires, that human hand or foot, right, but plays that role. So I think in a lot of ways the book speaks to where we are in the Black Lives Matter movement. Oh, that's okay. I was like, it's
Trying
mine.
to cut it off.
That's okay.
Technology.
I know our technology will betray us. I have learned. But I think it really speaks to where we are today in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement. I imagined what it might be like to be a member of the organization and to go through all of the arrests, the deaths, the incarcerations of the people that you started out with. If we all said we were going to become a chapter of the Black Panther Party in 1966, by 1976, only this side of the room might be left. The rest of us may have been killed, incarcerated, left, infiltrated, became spies, right? It wasn't an easy life, but the political commitment was there. And I feel like today when we think about the ongoing struggles, it requires that political commitment, and it requires a commitment to organizational history and organizations. I think that today there's a lot of individualism, and oftentimes people don't act in community with actual people they can sort of, rub shoulders with. And agree with or disagree with and sit at the table with. And I think that kind of face-to-face organizing, which the Panthers really believed in, and they really took to heart, right, this ideal of actually knocking on people's doors. I start off the book with me going down to Oakland in 1966 and wanting to interview a Panther, and he was like, well, just come in, he had no time for me, but he was willing to let me tag along whatever he was doing. So I would do that, and then we would be like knocking on the doors of housing projects, asking people if they wanted free health care. And that was in 1996. Today, you're terrified to knock on someone's door unannounced anywhere, right? Sad to say. But in this time period, we felt safe, comfortable doing that. People would open the door and be shocked that we were there offering free medical care. And yeah, okay, it was a clinic and you could only come on Wednesdays and there was a waiting list. But the idea of free medical care was, it was to challenge this idea of, what we pay for medical care. And to undercut that by having people question, the logic of the system. And that's what the Panthers really tried to do, is really make people question the logic of the system. And I feel like that's what we need to do today, because so many of those logics are accepted even in the way that we struggle against what we're fighting. So trying to think about that, I think there are a lot of sort of interesting lessons and food for thought for movements today to kind of take out of the history of the Black Panther Party in Oakland. So I really appreciate your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions that people have about the Panthers in general or the process of writing the book. I believe the basket may come around again, or you may feel newly emboldened after the talk. But I'll be happy to take some questions. I saw one, I'm just going to call it 1, 2, and if there was a third person somewhere over there. Okay, so 1, then 2. Yes.
Hi. I read your book and I loved it so much.
Oh, thank you.
And one of the things that I recognized was that the strict hierarchical structure of the Black Panthers seemed to be their downfall. And I was wondering if you had any insights about that.
I agree. I think the Panthers practiced democratic centralism, as they said. There was a lot of centralism and not a lot of democracy. And so it meant that if you were a rank and file member, there was no way for you to sort of, it's almost like not having a vote. Right? You didn't have a way of getting the leadership of the organization to listen, to change, or anything like that. And I think that's why many people chose to leave the organization, as versus anything else could have happened. For example, the leadership could have changed within the organization and the people could have stayed, right? That's certainly a possible outcome. But I think that people began to leave the organization with the understanding that those folks in leadership were not going to change. And as I think society changed in the 70s, and as the ravages of drugs really took over communities and was also pumped into community, it wasn't just that people made bad choices. It was really about a political structure that, targeted vulnerable populations, with false, solutions. And when the Panthers became ensnared in that, it became more and more difficult to sort of make anything happen. This is the cutest thing. So yes, I definitely agree that the structure was a downfall. And I think that's important because I know that today, one of the things that the movement for Black Lives is criticized for is for being so horizontal and for being, you can't point out the leaders anywhere. And I think that there's something to be said, for that. Of course, every structure has its strengths and its weaknesses. But I do think that it's important to kind of look at organizational forms as we try to move forward collectively, because not all of them work, will help us to move where we need to go. I saw your hand, and we'll come to you. Yes.
I had a similar question. I was wondering how they convinced the Black Panther movement, convinced the schools to let them in to feed the kids.
Good question. Well, they had a relationship with churches, right? So they would go to local churches in Oakland. Churches always have the, church basement. And they really marketed themselves as do-gooders, right? The idea was, here are hungry kids, we have food. And for many people, it was logical, right? Because you could clearly see the impact of the hunger on the learning outcomes, for the children. And, I think that because the Panthers were able to get donations and because they put in the labor and they had the goodwill of churches, that helped the program grow. And you'll see, like if you look at the FBI surveillance records of the Black Panther Party, you see that one of the things that they did is they actually went to those churches and other religious institutions, and they tried to undermine the relationships, either by sending them negative press clippings about the Panthers or different ways. I think that people assume that the Panthers were targeted because of their armed self-defense stance. That was certainly targeted, but their social programs were also targeted as well. Their newspaper was targeted, right? So that was definitely there too. I saw your hand, and we'll come in the front. Yes.
I just want to make a statement. Thank you for coming here and presenting your book and talking about this whole issue, because more people need to know about this from a positive perspective, and I think that's helpful. I was in school during that time, going to college, so I know how conflict really was making these groups make this decision, that we had too many people killed in the street. Malcolm X had been assassinated, Martin had been assassinated. I was going to a school debate meeting when Martin was assassinated. And I remember that people knew very much that they didn't want to go to Vietnam. We were in conflict. So I think that story has to be told to people, that Black Americans felt they had no home. They felt they didn't know where they were going. Their young men were being recruited on the street and say, if you did a misdemeanor or a felony, you go to jail or you go to the service. And so there were young people, I come from Indiana, and there were young people that went in front of a judge and said the service or jail. And so they went to jail, and we knew that too many were dying in Vietnam. So when you talk to the people of the 60s and the 70s, they say, yes, the Black Panthers is what we needed to hear. But Stokely became Kwame Ture. Kwame Ture. You get his name right? But he was Stokely Carmichael for a long time, fighting right along with Martin. So people don't know that the Black Panthers were there, and they said, this doesn't work, Martin, for us. So just to kind of, I'm not trying to take over your standing, but I'm just saying, it's good to get this information, and good to know about the women, because I do know a couple of people right here in the city who were in the Black Panther Party, and they never thought they were valid at the time. They joined because of the programs that were helping the community. And so this story needs to be told, and I'm glad that, I'm going to go back. They couldn't make it. They didn't know what was going on tonight, but they would have been here just to let you know that they were Black Panthers at that time.
Oh, wonderful. Right on.
It's great to hear it, and keep, with whatever you're doing all over in your book, you're telling people the truth.
That's wonderful. And I want to say that, my next book project actually grew out of this book project, which is Vietnam being everywhere. As I was learning about the Panthers and learning about this period and reading their newspapers, it was Vietnam, Vietnam, Vietnam. And I felt like nobody was talking about that, because when we think about the anti-war movement, we're not thinking about, we have a certain face in mind, like those dominant images, right? That's a fake face too, right? It's like some hippie person that's been made up. But they were, organized, politicized groups fighting U.S. imperialism in this time period.
And they took the women right to bear arms. That was their thing. They read the Constitution, of course. No one expected them to be walking around with guns. But that's what they did. They said, we have the right to do this. And they were essentially fighting the American government. And it was a rally because people just didn't know where they were going after high school. Get a job in a factory, or if they could get to college. Because college at that time was a far stretch for people. The schools were not admitting young blacks into schools, into prestigious schools. They had to go, as was told people, they had to go to black schools if they were going to. It wasn't that we chose that to continue the history of it. That's where we could get in. So,
definitely.
And I know we got some other people in my age, but they need to know this was 1966, 1967, 1968, all the way to the 70s. And we were totally disenfranchised. And for those of us who did know that we could go on, fought that war to go on.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing, and we appreciate that history. So I see one hand here, then I'll come over there. Yes.
Yeah, blessed love, sis. How you doing?
How you doing?
I love the title of the book. I hear the song in my head as I listen to it. having gone through this time and getting introduced to the revolution that has come, that has been going on ever since that original kidnap. You know, one of my former students has a phrase where he retermed the phrase BC to before captivity. And ever since that original kidnap, there's been a revolution for freedom. It's been ongoing. So coming in to the Panther Party at this time, a lot of us thought we were starting a revolution and not recognizing that we were part of a revolution that's been going on ever since. A struggle for freedom, a liberation struggle. The programs, the survival programs, you know, there were survival programs for a lot of reasons in terms of the survival of our communities, but also to give the Panther Party a different face than just guns. And the Panthers aren't the only ones who chose to use self-defense. I'm glad you mentioned this, the Black Panther Party for self-defense, because people won't even think of it that way. They think of it as an offensive kind of thing. And they say you can kill a revolutionary, but you can't kill a revolution. So the revolution is still going on, you know, and you don't have to romanticize about what people did back in the 60s. You know, the front line is right here, right today. So, you know, for all of you who want to look at the Panther Party and romanticize it, you know, the struggle comes on all levels. You know, freedom by any means necessary, by every means necessary is freedom. So I love the title. I can hear the song.
Oh. That's great. And you know, it's important. Thank you for sharing that. And also important to note that, you know, so many Panthers, as well as people who were part of other liberation movements of this time period, are with us incarcerated as political prisoners, largely forgotten by the larger society. You know, we have Oscar Lopez Rivera, you know, coming, you know, getting the presidential release, but there's so many others, right? Puerto Rican independentistas, you know, there's just so many others, and it's just about also, you know, what we can do for those people. And in a human way, like I said, in sort of a very human way, you can simply write. You know, write to them, find out their story, learn about them, sign a petition around them, talk to somebody who knows them. Seth Hayes, I believe, is right here, semi-close to this area, former Panther. You know, there are many others. Mumia Abu-Jamal, very well known in Philadelphia. So just getting involved in that is just one way. And sometimes when it feels like overwhelming, you can't do anything, but you can write a letter. You know, it's just one small thing. Okay, I saw your hand. Yes.
So you partially maybe answered my question, but I'm impressed on your being able to like keep such a tight focus on just Oakland when it was like such a web of communities. Was there a temptation to try to cover like various chapters, and or is that temptation still there? Is there any like idea of, you know, writing and like some of the history of like the other chapters around the country?
That's a good question. I mean, Oakland was important to me, even though Oakland has received a lot of attention as the space where the Black Panther Party was. But because Oakland was the national headquarters, it was important to me to imagine the transformation of the Oakland Panthers. Like I said, when I say Oakland Panthers in 1966, I mean these 5 people. When I say the Oakland Panthers in 1967, I mean this room full of people. When I say the Oakland Panthers in 1968, I mean the headquarters of a nationwide organization. By 1969, I mean the headquarters of a global organization. So trying to think about like how Oakland is changing. You know, Oakland, even though it's one place, that it's a place that's evolving. And so I did speak to people who were part of other chapters because I wanted to know, like, so did people from Oakland come out here? How were they received? You know, I think also because the leadership was centered in Oakland. It wasn't like a nationwide organization with, you know, leadership coming from other parts of the country. They were people who could have been and should have been, I think, maybe nationwide known leaders and were nationally known leaders like Geronimo Pratt from Los Angeles and Fred Hampton from Chicago and, you know, many others, Afeni Shakur from New York. you know, these were Panthers that were doing so much in their local area that they had a nationwide effect on the organization. But it was important for me to know how people saw Oakland so I could juxtapose with how Oakland saw themselves. It's almost like how we imagine we exist in our children's minds. You know, like we're all knowing, all powerful, yes, and then when you speak to the child, it's just like, you know, I have many sources of authority. You know, there's my teacher, there's the church, you know, it's all of these things going on, and my parents is part of a constellation of things. I think that that's how it was, that yeah, Oakland saw itself as sort of the dominant definer of what the Panthers were, but then all across the country, people were doing their own thing as well, right? And sometimes in contradiction, like for example, I read how in, where's that, Milwaukee, you know, the Panthers had a reading list, and Soul on Ice was on there. And if you've ever read Soul on Ice, raise your hand if you've read Soul on Ice, right? There's some problematic things in there, to put it mildly. So that particular chapter said, no, we're not reading that, you know? We have a problem with that content. Yes, this is our leader and, you know, et cetera, but we're not going to read that here, right? And they made their own choices. I mean, the Panthers in different parts of the country grew out of different organizations, different political traditions. In New York, for example, very nationalist. You have Panthers with names like Afeni Shakur, Asada Shakur. You don't have those African, you know, derivative names coming out of the Bay Area. Right? You just don't. It's a different context, a different way of seeing oneself, of seeing the struggle, of seeing Pan-Africanism and its connection, right? It was a local flavor of the organization. So that was important to me because I knew that Oakland was not open to all of it, right? They had a vision of, you know, themselves as the singular leader despite the travels, right? And then one of the gifts of COINTELPRO and surveillance was like a very thick log of phone records, right? And sometimes it would be verbatim. Other times you could tell that people were summarizing, the agents who were copying down the information. But lots of times where people called in from all around the country to Oakland, hey, are we still using the Red Book? You know, and then they get their response and then they go out and, you know, you can see that locally it had a different meaning. So that was an exciting part. I never felt tempted to focus on other Panthers in other locations because I really felt like there was something about that Oakland story that I wanted to tell. And those particular set of personalities and leaders were pretty well documented, and I wanted to bring something new to how they were perceived. I do think, I mean, some of the people who were part of the Black Panther Party, you know, really deserve in a lot of ways. And the bathroom is fascinating. If you go in there, you will understand why she keeps wanting to go in there. There's a lot to see, a lot to do in that bathroom. But yeah, I mean, I felt that Oakland was just the place that sort of captured my heart. Despite being a New Yorker, and when you get there and you're a New Yorker, they're not happy about that. Like, you know, how can you know about what we know? And so you kind of have to go back and just be a, you know, a constant presence. I saw two hands here, so I'm going to go to you first. Yes?
So in your description of the book, you talk about relying on FBI files in order to write a lot of it. Could you talk about the perception of the FBI of the Black Panther Party and how that was different from their own perception?
That's a good question. I think that from the FBI perception, it varied. I mean, I think there were moments where the FBI was convinced of the danger that the Black Panther Party held to what they saw as the American way of life, or the fabric, or law and order, or all of the things they felt that they were sworn to uphold. And then I think there were moments where they clearly understood that they were talking about a small group of people with very limited resources who were backed against the wall oftentimes, and they felt no compulsion in squashing them. Right? So I think it was a duality. On the one hand, it was like the Panthers were like these larger-than-life revolutionaries, and I think on the other hand, there was the sense that the Panthers had all of these entree points that were vulnerable that the FBI could manipulate. So they talked about that. They talked about, you know, getting in between people's marital relationships, right? As the Panthers, you know, one of the things you can do is look at the newspaper and you can see their evolving stance on marriage, on monogamy, on free love. I mean, they're evolving at a time of the sexual revolution, of the wide-scale, you know, discourse around birth control. Are birth control pills genocide? Are we having babies for the revolution? Who's going to take care of those babies if political women have children? This was not just in the Panthers. This was in AIM. This was in SDS. This was in all the organizations. You know, these discussions were happening. And the FBI saw that as like a little keyhole that they could sort of insert themselves in, you know, around, you know, messing up relationships, about going to people's parents. I mean, that's the thing that I found so interesting about the FBI repression, that it was sort of large scale, what we think about, the shootouts, the killing of Fred Hampton, the dissent between Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver. But there were all of these other moments that just, you know, undermine trust. And if I have a problem with you, I'm not going to say that it's an ideological issue. I'm just going to say I saw you talking to somebody, and maybe you're an agent, right? And, you know, it worked in that way as well within the organization, as people use the context of repression as a way of working out conflicts in the absence of other ways of working out conflict, if that makes sense. I saw your hand, and I think someone, yes, we'll come back to you.
Do you talk about the schism that was able to be split between Oakland and New York?
I do. Okay. I do, and I talk about it as, I think that the way that it's been talked about has been very sort of male-centered. It's like Huey Newton versus Eldridge Cleaver, you know, fight at 11 kind of thing. And instead, I think about the ideologies, like things like financial hierarchies, right? Just how that became an issue. Like I said, if you're joining the organization and you've given over your 10 sneakers and you've got 2 left and everyone else is wearing your sneakers, if someone comes out and you see them with, you know, a certain level of lifestyle, you know, you might be a little angry. People talked about things like, you know, one of the leaders within the organization wearing what was at the time called Pimp Socks. So these were like dress socks that were like sheer linen with, like, you could imagine, like with stripes, or you might see it in some churches today. Steve Harvey, perhaps, if you get that idea. But, you know, it was the ideal of having these like really fancy, expensive socks. And how dare you have those socks? I mean, if I see my leader with those socks on, and I know that I had brown rice for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and my clothes have holes in them. I mean, people were thinking about the finances of it all. Are we a collective? Are we all sacrificing for the organization? You know, on the other hand, there were some people who felt like, yeah, the leaders should have more. They were in jail. They, you know, they deserve more. It wasn't like one opinion on that, but the finances and who should get what resources. When I'm in jail, you know, how fast are you bailing me out? You know, if I've been waking up at 5 o'clock for like the last year and a half, why do I have to wait in jail? You know, where's that money? You know, those issues of finances, I think, were also part of that New York, California split. And the question of strategy, like, what is the correct way forward in revolution? Is this the revolutionary moment? Is this the time to take it to the streets? Or do we need to, you know, retreat, redirect, and focus on the community development model, right? That was also a question. It seems now, you know, everyone's like, oh, breakfast programs, that was so great. Who could be against that? But there were debates over, is this, where are we putting our time? There's only but so many of us. Is our goal to create as many of these community programs as possible? Are we just gonna have 1 or 2 flagships in order to do political education and put the rest of our time elsewhere? I mean, these were political strategies that they thought about. These were resources that they manipulated, and people had different opinions on that. You know, again, New York, Oakland, definitely I think it fell out along those lines, but I think it was big. It was like around these big issues.
The nationalist aspect of it, and the so-called revolutionary nationalists, as opposed to the cultural nationalists. And the sister back here asked about the breakfast programs being in the school. The breakfast programs were in the churches, and then when they co-opted, the schools began to develop breakfast for children. But the breakfast programs were primarily in churches and community centers before the children went to school. They weren't in the schools primarily until the schools began to co-opt the breakfast program and began feeding the children breakfast in the morning.
Definitely. I think it's important to kind of, again, sort of think that through in terms of what's the benefit of these things. I think sometimes we think of things as just in a sort of a totalizing way, like, okay, yes, it's good. The more breakfast programs we can have, the better. The more free health clinics, the better. But then the question is about the education of people, not just the provision of the services. I don't think the Panthers ever imagined that they were going to replace, healthcare in America. The idea was to have people think about how healthcare was funded and to become aware of that and agitate and demand for alternatives.
But in Oakland, they have political clout through Ron Dolan and others. They have political clout which got them into the schools.
Definitely. I saw your hand. Yes.
And besides all of the backlash that came from the problems, you say Black Panther now, I know in my neighborhood, there is an awakening. They're aware of the time when people were realizing, this is what I'm missing. This is what I'm supposed to have. Here's a program. So if you're feeding hungry children, you're giving the sneakers to children who are wearing their brothers, the girls wearing their brothers' old shoes. This is an awakening. And that's what we mostly remember, the awakening. Because there were several groups like the Panthers, and they're not spoken of that often, but there were the Deacons. They were also a group of black men with such power. So when we read about them and we know our history, we know they were powerful. But any time in America and you have a black situation that is positive, you're going to have the animals nip away until it looks like it's nothing. But you're doing what you're supposed to do, like the first people did. So the Panther name still remains. I was in California with my children in '68 when I was visiting relatives, and this motorcycle went by, and my uncle said, "There's some Panthers on the motorcycle." My kids were glued to the window. I mean, this was like saying, "Did Christ walk down the street today?" And it still has a power with saying it. So with all of that, we expect that. The things that make it, we come into the groove, we bow those things which are of value to us. So that's some of the American way. And we're aware.
Definitely.
I just want to say, not to be redundant, but I just think it's amazing that they lasted 10 years or however long. With all of this infiltration, like I've been watching blaxploitation, I'm going to put it in quotes because I've been watching some different films from the 70s. I'm like, wow, this is amazing that this was being created in the 70s. And, it was so, to me, it was like shining a light. I was like, whoa, you have all of these elements going on. I just think it's awesome that they were able to have the organization for as long as it did, and it's affirming and it's encouraging that when people come together and, just shine a light on what's going on and organize to make something positive, they have such long-lasting effects. But, it's such a sacrifice when you think about, because I'm, building this organization and organizing for social change and positive social change, that someone's going to come from the government and destroy my marriage, or somebody's going to come from the government and destroy my friendship and my brotherhood and sisterhood that I've created and camaraderie. And, I'm still moving on with that, and I'm trying to expand my ideas in of, okay, well, what's a marriage? What's a friendship? What's a this? What's a that? It's like, well, and of course it wasn't perfect, but it's awesome. It's awesome. I know there's been a lot of criticism, and there's been a lot of of course people are thinking critically, hopefully, but it's been amazing.
Yeah, I thought so. I definitely thought so, and I was just amazed at the reading that people did. like Frantz Fanon, that's not an easy read. Like the Red Book, if you actually like to see a Red Book, you know, people really dedicated themselves to learning. And it was like, it would be street corner conversation. And to me, that's the amazing part, that it went from all levels, that it excited people and they were wanting and hungry to learn. You know, that is what I would love to sort of have back today. And I do see that hunger is there again today, that hunger for justice, which has never really gone anywhere, you know, BC, right? But sort of moving that towards the collective, right? We may tend to do that more individually today as we hunger. And there are a lot of distractions in some ways that weren't there before, right? So it may seem like we don't have time, you know, as we binge watch TV and we're on our phones, and, you know, we are also under a lot of, you know, pressure societally. I mean, if you can just see, there's just, I mean, especially since the election, right, the volume has been turned up on suffering of all types. New people are at the suffer table, joining the people that were always there. So, you know, really important to kind of think about, well, how do we make good use of this moment, right, as an organizing moment as well. Any final thoughts or? Yes.
Just a couple of questions about your research. You were talking about using the materials from the FBI and COINTELPRO. Did you have to make FOIA requests to access that, or had those requests already been made, or were they in the library, or how were you able to?
Good question. So I made some Freedom of Information Act requests. I also utilized, like, the Newton records had a lot of FBI information from the Panther National Office, from David Hilliard as an individual, from Huey Newton. Those records were traced back to the organizational papers that were there after Huey Newton was killed in 1989. As I mentioned, that was the Central Park Jogger. That's when I started graduate school. That's when I graduated college, and that's when Huey Newton was killed. And it was the papers that were in his possession that became the nucleus of that repository at Stanford. Now, because people disagreed with the location of it at Stanford and the cost of it being sold, many people felt that that was unfair. It really spurred a lot of Panthers to just put their records in other places. So there were people who went to Howard and they went to HBCUs and to, you know, repositories that were, they consider more positive than Stanford, where the Hoover Center is, and deposited their records as well. So I had those Freedom of Information Act requests as well. So those were some of the sources.
I was also wondering, with the oral history work that you did, the interviews, because you were doing interviews and reporting them, right? Are those in libraries, collections now, or what happened with those interviews that you reported?
That's a good question. I'm sort of going through the process of depositing those interviews. Unfortunately, several people that I interviewed have since passed away. I think that's just the reality of the time period. So I'm giving those back to their families and giving them the, you know, decision making over, you know, the content and where they would want to see it. Because in a lot of ways, like even like Bobby Seale's brother, for example, John Seale, passed away, and he wasn't a big person in the organization. I mean, I guess he was known because his brother was Bobby Seale, but he didn't have like a major intellectual role or a title ever. But it was very meaningful for him to hear hear that voice again, you know, on the little cassette. So I also am transferring it from cassette tapes into the files on the computer, MP3, I think, yeah. Yes?
Yeah, I'm really naive about the role of Black Panthers in upstate New York, specifically Rochester. And I was wondering, is there a connection between John Africa and the Black Panthers and the people in Rochester?
That's a good question.
Do you know much about that?
I do know a little bit about the MOVE organization in Philadelphia.
Yeah, but they started up.
Right, but I don't know about that connection there, I have to say, yeah. Yeah, I should say I'm part of the campaign to bring Lumia home. And one of the things we do is an interview show where we interview people under the lines of Inside the Actor Studio. It's called Inside the Activist Studio. And it's on YouTube. And so I did the first one with Sekou Odinga. It's a group effort. I'm just the person who sits there and does the interview, but there are like 30 people who work very, very hard for usually about a year to collect information. And we recently did Ramona Africa, so her interview will be out soon as well. I don't know so much about the history of MOVE. I was told that there was a National Committee to Combat Fascism that was somewhere here in upstate New York. Yeah, I don't know about an actual Panther chapter. Other questions or
I'd like to make a comment.
thoughts or comments?
The
Yes.
comment I want to make basically is the sister was talking about 10 years. The point I was trying to make is that the Panther Party didn't begin the struggle, and the struggle didn't end when the Panther Party officially ended. The struggle was an ongoing struggle. And, you know, that's why I love the title, The Revolution Has Come. The revolution is here. The revolution is here, and we all contribute to it, or contribute to the counter-revolution by the choices we make day to day. So don't think about it as a romantic thing that happened way back then. You know, it's happening by the choices and the choices we allow others in electoral politics and other kind of things to make for us, you know. So it's here. It ain't no make-believe.
Definitely, the revolution has come.
Yeah.
Thank you.